Asking the right questions underscore a guide to CRI. M. Neil Browne. Asking the right questions. A guide to critical thinking is a practical manual for turning intellectual independence into a repeatable discipline. It moves from finding an argument's issue, conclusion, and reasons through ambiguity, assumptions, fallacies, evidence, causation, statistics, omitted information, alternative conclusions, and the mental habits that interfere with judgment. This summary follows that sequence as a single apprenticeship in slow, strong-sense thinking. Abstract. Asking the Right Questions. A Guide to Critical Thinking, 12th edition, Pearson, 2018, by M. Neil Browne and Stuart M. Keeley, with writing and speaking contributions from Mary Vasudeva, is a practical manual for evaluating persuasive communication and constructing arguments of one's own. Its 13 chapters form a sequential protocol. Identify the issue and conclusion, locate the reasons, clarify ambiguous language, uncover value and descriptive assumptions, detect fallacies, evaluate anecdotal and systematic evidence, search for rival causes, test statistics, find significant omissions, generate alternative conclusions, and resist the cognitive speed bumps that distort judgment. The authors join procedural instruction to a humane ethic of autonomy, curiosity, humility, and respect for good reasoning. This summary follows the book's progression from intellectual dependence toward responsible judgment. It preserves the sponge and panning for gold metaphor, the distinction between weak sense and strong sense critical thinking, the repeated practice passages, and the movement from reading and listening to writing and speaking. The central finding is that critical thinking is not the possession of a set of correct answers, but the deliberate habit of asking whether a belief has earned the degree of confidence we give it, and of conducting that inquiry in a tone that keeps conversation possible. Executive summary. The world described by asking the right questions is crowded with confident voices, selective evidence, disagreeing experts, and minds that prefer a quick answer to a careful one. The book does not respond by asking the reader to distrust everyone or to become an isolated authority. It asks for something harder and more useful. Depend on other people while retaining rational control of what they give you. Begin with the question that has actually stimulated the discussion and the conclusion the speaker wants accepted. Then follow the reasons, clarify the words, expose the values and descriptions taken for granted, and test the evidence rather than borrowing its confidence. A claim becomes worthy of belief, not because it arrives with a title, statistic, expert, or stirring story, but because it survives the questions that reveal what it is made of. The sequence widens as the book proceeds. It moves from the visible skeleton of an argument to the hidden bridge of assumptions, from vivid testimony to samples and measures, from correlation to rival causes, from impressive numbers to omitted denominators and consequences, and finally from the examination of other people's minds to the speed bumps within our own. Strong sense critical thinking is the governing demand. Use the same scrutiny on the belief that flatters your side as on the belief that threatens it. Slow down. Allow a qualified conclusion when the evidence requires one. Ask as a curious partner rather than a prosecutor, and let the best available answer become a way of acting without pretending that it cannot be improved. Central thesis. Asking the right questions begins in a world crowded with persuaders who present only the half of reality useful to their purposes, while experts disagree and human beings reach for quick, emotional answers. The remedy is neither blind trust nor isolated self-reliance. We need other people, research, testimony, and expertise, but we must become the carpenters who measure the materials before building a belief. The book therefore teaches a portable sequence of questions. What issue is being discussed? And what conclusion is being offered? What reasons support it? Which words carry more than one possible meaning? What values and beliefs have been left unstated? Has the reasoning slipped into a fallacy? How dependable are the experience, authority, observation, study, statistic, and causal story being used as evidence? What significant information has been omitted, and what other conclusions could the same reasons permit? The sequence matters because each question protects the next. We cannot evaluate evidence before we know what it is evidence for, and we cannot judge a conclusion fairly until we have recovered the communicator's actual meaning and hidden assumptions. Yet the method is not merely forensic. Strong-sense critical thinking applies the questions to our own beliefs, seeks contrary perspectives, recognizes the value conflicts beneath ethical disputes, and accepts qualified conclusions rather than forcing every question into yes or no. Its final test is character and conduct. Slow down when the mind wants a quick answer. Resist the comfort of truthiness. Ask hard questions as a curious partner rather than a prosecutor, and act on the best conclusion available while remaining willing to improve it. Foundational observations. Questions before judgment. The protocol begins by recovering the issue, conclusion, reasons, and meanings of an argument before evaluating its strength. This sequence is a discipline of fairness. One cannot criticize what one has not first understood. The invisible bridge, value and descriptive assumptions connect visible reasons to conclusions. Arguments often appear persuasive because the bridge has been left unstated, not because the bridge has been justified. Evidence has a weight. Personal experience, vivid cases, testimonials, authorities, observations, surveys, research, and statistics can all inform judgment, but none carries automatic authority. The right question is not whether something counts as evidence, but how much weight it deserves. Causation requires rivals. A plausible explanation is not the explanation. Correlation, sequence, and a compelling story must be tested against reverse causes, common causes, mutual influence, and multiple contributory conditions. Omission is an argumentative act. Every communicator selects what to show. Critical autonomy therefore searches for missing definitions, procedures, comparisons, counterarguments, negative effects, and failed predictions. Gray thinking. Reasons rarely dictate one conclusion. Conditional language and attention to when, where, and why preserve action without pretending to possess more certainty than the evidence allows. Strong sense self-application. Critical thinking becomes weak when it is used only to defeat opponents. Its demanding form turns the questions upon one's own beliefs, affiliations, preferred authorities, and comforting explanations. Curiosity as civic form. Questions can become cross-examination or partnership. The book's ideal critical thinker makes humility visible, respects good reasoning wherever it appears, and keeps the conversation open long enough for minds to change. Significance and recommendation. The book matters because it treats critical thinking as both an epistemic discipline and a form of relationship. It teaches readers to resist manipulation without becoming cynical, to rely on experts without becoming their mental subjects, and to disagree without making inquiry impossible. It is especially useful for students, writers, teachers, citizens, and anyone making medical, legal, financial, ethical, or personal decisions in an information-saturated world. Its examples and terminology are introductory, and some claims with themselves deserve the questions the book teaches, but its durable recommendation remains exact. Slow down, reconstruct the argument, test the hidden links, seek the strongest opposing evidence, choose a conclusion with conditions attached, and let better reasons change what you believe. Chapter 1. The benefit and manner of asking the right questions. The book begins by imagining a world in which critical thinking would be unnecessary. In that easier world, anyone trying to persuade us would disclose the disadvantages of the proposal. Dependable experts would agree with one another, and our own minds would become calm, reflective, and curious whenever a serious choice appeared. The real world is the reverse. Advertisers, politicians, institutions, commentators, and ordinary acquaintances press upon us from every side, telling us what to wear, eat, buy, believe, and become, often offering only the half of the truth that serves their purpose. A quick search for the dangers of yoga can produce a catalog of terror, just as a drug company can present the benefits of a pill while leaving its funded research and possible harms in the dark. The difficulty is not merely that persuaders are incomplete. The people we hope will rescue us, the experts, are often wrong and often disagree. One authority warns us away from the sun, while another warns that too little sunlight may be more dangerous. One body links pet ownership to health while another study links it to poor health. One specialist dismisses the danger of cell phone radiation while another recommends a public warning. The point is not to discard expertise. We cannot function without depending upon people who know more than we do. The point is to refuse the posture of the helpless puppet. Experts provide materials for judgment. We must measure and construct the decision ourselves. Quote, "The alternative is being the mental slave of the last person we encountered. The noisy, confused world. The imaginary world is useful because it removes, one by one, the reasons we need judgment, dishonest persuasion, conflicting authorities, and the mind's own impatience. Once those protections disappear, the reader can see that critical thinking is not an academic luxury added to an otherwise manageable life. It is the ordinary defense required by a world in which every important choice arrives surrounded by selective information and confident advice. Experts, minds, and critical thinking. This responsibility is the necessity of rational control. Critical thinking is not a storehouse of correct opinions, but a set of evaluation skills activated by three conditions: awareness of interrelated critical questions, the ability to ask and answer them at appropriate times, and the desire to use them. The last condition matters as much as the first two. A person may know how to detect a weak reason and still prefer not to do so when the weak reason protects a cherished conclusion. The goal is therefore a trained disposition, not a classroom performance. The questions should become part of who we are. The book also distinguishes weak sense from strong sense critical thinking. Weak sense thinking uses the tools of criticism to defend what one already believes, treating disagreement as an enemy to be defeated. Strong sense thinking applies the same questions to every claim, especially one's own. It does not require us to abandon an initial belief. It requires us to earn the right to keep it. An opinion becomes worthy of confidence when it has been selected from alternatives we have understood and evaluated, and when we still retain enough humility to ask, "Might I be wrong?" The distinction turns open-mindedness into something more demanding than a friendly attitude. It is a discipline of self-exposure. We must permit good reasons to strengthen our beliefs, but also to revise or remove them. The reader is being asked to become the supervisor of who she is becoming, neither surrendering judgment to experts nor mistaking independence for isolation. Sponge and panning for gold thinking. The central image for this discipline is the contrast between a sponge and a prospector. The sponge absorbs information. This is not useless. Knowledge supplies the material for later thought, and a person cannot evaluate what she has never encountered. But absorption alone has no method for deciding what to retain. The sponge believes whatever it read last, and so the last confident voice becomes the temporary owner of the mind. The panning for gold reader is active. She enters a text hoping to acquire knowledge, but she also asks why the writer wants her to believe each claim, records possible problems, evaluates what is being said, and forms her own conclusion on the basis of its reasonableness. The metaphor preserves the value of information while refusing passivity. There must be gravel in the pan before there can be gold, but not everything in the pan is gold. Quote, "The panning for gold approach stresses active interaction with knowledge as it is being acquired." Quote, "The most important characteristic of the panning for gold approach is interactive involvement, a dialogue between the writer and the reader, or the speaker and the listener. As a critical thinker, you're willing to agree with others, but first you need some convincing answers to your questions. This is why the critical questions are useful even when the reader is not an expert on the subject. One need not be a specialist in childcare to ask what evidence supports an assessment of daycare centers. The questions create a portable method of inquiry. They let the reader inspect the structure of a claim before possessing every fact in the field. Strong sense thinking and practice. Practice is therefore not an appendix to critical thinking, but its means of formation. The author's exercises and think-aloud responses deliberately display the planting, weeding, fertilizing, and pruning of an answer rather than presenting only the finished flower. The model is allowed to hesitate, test a possibility, reject it, and try again. Critical thinking is learned through that visible struggle, because the mind must acquire not only definitions but a rhythm of delay. That rhythm is especially necessary because human beings think quickly. Kahneman's System 1 is automatic, emotional, and immediate. Haidt's image of the raging elephant and the tiny rider gives the same problem a comic force. The reader's task is to slow the elephant long enough for the rider to inspect the road. The questions become a trained reaction to what is heard and read, a way of inserting judgment between the stimulus and the conclusion, values, conversation, and communication. Critical thinking is social from the beginning. Other people are the sources of the facts, opinions, and conclusions from which our own understanding is built. Yet we tend to seek those who share our value priorities and to avoid those whose priorities disturb our settled picture. The authors define values as ideas people see as worthwhile, standards by which they measure conduct. They name 4 primary values of the critical thinker: autonomy, curiosity, humility, and respect for good reasoning wherever it appears. Autonomy needs contrary voices because we cannot choose intelligently from possibilities we have refused to hear. Curiosity turns other minds into sources of discovery. Humility admits the limits of even the cleverest person, and respect judges reasoning by its quality rather than by the speaker's party, wealth, race, age, or citizenship. Questioning, however, can feel like prosecution to the person being questioned. The good critical thinker, therefore, makes curiosity visible, clarifies what the other person means, asks what evidence could change the person's mind, seeks common values, and treats disagreement as a joint search rather than a verbal bloodbath. The same obligation governs writing and speaking. Aggressive tone may win a momentary cheer while driving away the very reader who most needs to hear the argument. A vivid insult, such as Roger Ebert's comparison of a film to a choir in hell, may be memorable, but closes the door to reconsideration. The writer must also resist sponging off experts. Other people's words may support an argument, but they cannot replace the work of finding out what we think and why. Before developing a thesis, the strong sense writer searches for the best counterargument, incorporates expert judgment as support rather than ventriloquism, and leaves the audience an opening through which the conversation can continue. The chapter's first lesson is therefore both intellectual and civic. Ask hard questions in a way that tells the other person, "I want to learn," and make your own conclusions firm enough to guide action, but open enough to be improved. Autonomy. Form one's own conclusions by hearing the widest possible range of serious alternatives. Curiosity. Treat other minds as sources of knowledge and ask questions that move beyond partial understanding. Humility. Remember that intelligence does not cancel fallibility, and that disagreement may reveal a gap in one's own view. Respect for good reasoning. Judge the reasoning rather than the race, party, wealth, age, or citizenship of the person offering it. Quote, "We are learners, not warriors." Chapter 2. What are the issue and the conclusion? Descriptive and prescriptive issues. Before evaluating reasoning, we must first find the reasoning. The first task is to separate the issue, the question or controversy that stimulates a discussion, from the conclusion, the position the communicator wants us to accept. If we fail to locate the conclusion, we may criticize a claim the writer never made and congratulate ourselves for defeating a phantom. The authors distinguish 2 broad kinds of issues. Descriptive issues ask how the world was, is, or will be. Whether musical training improves mathematical learning, what causes domestic abuse, or whether a drug effectively treats depression. Prescriptive issues ask what the world ought to be, whether intelligent design should be taught in public schools, what ought to be done about Medicaid fraud, or whether SUVs must be outlawed to reduce asthma. The distinction is not ornamental. A descriptive claim calls for evidence about accuracy. A prescriptive claim also requires attention to values, consequences, and what counts as desirable. The categories can blur, and the authors acknowledge that their division is a useful simplification rather than a mechanical law. Still, asking which kind of issue is in play prevents a common confusion. treating an empirical description as if it automatically dictated a moral or political prescription. Finding the issue and conclusion. Sometimes a communicator states the issue plainly in a title, an opening question, or a sentence such as "the question I am raising is." More often, the issue must be inferred. Ask what event or controversy the writer is reacting to. Inspect the opening and closing, and learn enough about the author's background to recognize what question the person is likely addressing. There need not be one magical wording of the issue. Any formulation is adequate if it captures the question that organizes the entire argument. The conclusion is easier to recognize when we ask, what is the writer trying to prove, or what is the communicator's main point? The structure is this because of that. This is the conclusion, and that is the support. A conclusion is not simply any assertion. A claim with no supporting statements is a mere opinion. A conclusion is an idea inferred from other ideas. In the example about genetically modified food, the warning about unknown health effects is a reason, while the demand that such food should not be legal is the conclusion because the reason is being used to support it. Quote, "We cannot critically evaluate until we find the conclusion. Once located, the conclusion becomes the destination toward which every later question is directed." The reader asks whether the conclusion should be accepted on the basis of what supports it, not whether the reader likes the topic or agrees with the speaker's tone. Clues and practice. The book supplies 5 practical clues. First, identify the issue, because a conclusion is always a response to one. Second, watch for indicator words such as therefore, thus, consequently, it follows that, and the truth of the matter is. These words are not infallible, but they function like neon signs. Third, look at likely locations. Many conclusions appear near the beginning or the end. Fourth, remember what a conclusion is not. Examples, statistics, definitions, background information, and evidence may support the conclusion but are not the conclusion itself. Fifth, use context and the communicator's background as clues, while remembering that a clue is not proof. The practice passages turn this method into self-talk. In the homeschooling example, the phrase "the truth of the matter" points toward the conclusion that homeschooling is usually a mistake. The issue can then be reconstructed as whether parents should homeschool. In the social media example, the opening statements about increasing use are background, while the final recommendation that parents restrict children's access is the conclusion because the intervening harms answer the question, why? The method is deliberately modest. Find a statement the evidence seeks to support, then work backward from it to the issue and forward into evaluation. Issue. What question or controversy is the communication answering? Indicator words. Which terms announce that a conclusion or reason is about to appear? Likely locations. What do the opening and closing sentences reveal about the communicator's destination? Exclusions. Which statements are examples, statistics, definitions, background, or evidence rather than the conclusion? Context. What does the author's background or institutional setting suggest, and what must still be verified? The chapter thus teaches a first act of fairness. Do not begin by measuring the argument against your own preferred question. Recover the question the communicator is actually answering, recover the answer being offered, and only then decide whether the argument deserves your belief. Chapter 3. What are the reasons? Reasons, evidence, and argument structure. The conclusion is only the visible destination of an argument. Reasons and evidence are the road by which the communicator hopes to get us there. A claim such as, "music has more power to change the world than all political leaders," may be true, false, or undecidable, but by itself it gives us no basis for agreement. Reasons are the explanations or rationales offered for believing a conclusion. Evidence is the factual support used to show that those reasons are dependable. Together, they form the argument's warrants. Arguments have intent. Someone wants us to believe something or act in a certain way, and the quality of the support varies. That is why the reader must resist the impulse to judge too quickly. The first obligation is structural. Identify the conclusion and then locate the statements meant to support it. If either component remains invisible, evaluation has no object. Wittgenstein's imagined advice, wait, is therefore not a delay in thinking, but the beginning of fair thinking. Asking why and keeping the structure straight. Once the conclusion is known, ask the simple and powerful question, why does the writer or speaker believe that? Any statement that answers this question as the communicator intends is a reason, whether or not it actually succeeds is one. The principle of charity operates at this stage. We first reconstruct the argument the person believes she has made. Only afterward do we decide whether the reason truly supports the conclusion. Treating an apparent reason as a reason is not surrender. It is the condition of criticizing the real argument rather than a caricature. Indicator words such as because, as a result of, studies show that, and is supported by can help, but no word can replace attention to function. A statement may appear near a conclusion and still be background, evidence, or an intermediate conclusion. In a long argument, one conclusion may serve as a reason for another, while that reason is itself supported by subordinate reasons. Paraphrasing the structure in one's own words helps keep the levels apart. The conclusion depends on the merit of the reasons. Weak reasons create weak reasoning. Quote, remember, wait before evaluating. Managed reasoning and writing. The chapter's sharpest warning is against choosing a conclusion first and shopping afterward for reasons that will make it attractive. This is managed reasoning. The warrants are selected not because they're the strongest or truest, but because they move an audience toward a predetermined result. The authors distinguish the advocate who receives a client's conclusion and must argue for it from the scientist whose conclusion should be shaped by reasons and evidence. The danger is not confined to lawyers. Whenever a person becomes angry or puzzled when asked for reasons, or produces reasons only after an opinion has been challenged, weak sense thinking may be managing the argument. For one's own writing, the order must be reversed. Begin with a clear, interesting issue. Formulate a focused and explicit conclusion. Gather reasons that answer the why question. Research the evidence. And organize the material so the reader can see the skeleton. A prompt such as, write about your favorite video game, is too loose until it becomes a question that can be answered, such as what makes a particular game great. The issue must engage the audience. The thesis must be easy to locate, and each reason must visibly support it. If research does not yield strong reasons, the honest response is to revise the conclusion rather than decorate a weak one. The resulting discipline is both rhetorical and intellectual. Indicator words make the structure visible. Research tests whether the writer knows enough. Counterarguments demonstrate that the writer has not simply sponged from favorite authority. An organization lets the audience follow the reasoning from question to answer. A strong argument is not an opinion wearing formal clothing. It is a conclusion that has allowed reasons and evidence to shape what it claims. Chapter 4. What words or phrases are ambiguous? Key terms and multiple meanings. Finding the issue, conclusion, and reasons give an argument its visible structure, but structure alone does not guarantee that we know what has been said. The next question concerns language. Which words or phrases have meanings uncertain enough that we need clarification before judging the reasoning? A claim about experienced coaches, for example, cannot be evaluated until we know whether experience means years of playing, games coached, or years at a particular competitive level. Ambiguity is not simply bad manners. Constitutional language may remain open so that it can meet changing circumstances, and ordinary communication cannot eliminate every possible uncertainty. But a person trying to persuade us has a responsibility to clarify the ambiguities that affect the argument. A word becomes critical when two plausible meanings fit the context, and changing the meaning changes how strongly a reason supports the conclusion. Testing and clarifying ambiguity. Begin with the issue, then inspect the conclusion and reasons for load-bearing terms. Abstract words are especially dangerous because they refer to fewer concrete instances. Freedom, fairness, quality, happiness, health risk, and responsibility can carry several reasonable pictures. Reverse role-playing helps expose the problem. Ask how a person who disagrees might define the same term. Someone who regards dog shows as entertainment may understand cruelty to animals very differently from someone who sees the shows as exploitation. The test is practical. Ask, what do you mean by that? Generate alternative meanings, substitute each into the argument, and see whether the support changes. In an advertisement promising that a sleep aid works great, the phrase could mean that the pill makes one drowsy, knocks one out, or produces a restful morning. The attractive vagueness does persuasive work precisely because each reader supplies the desired meaning. The tanning example shows why the ambiguity must be located in the whole reasoning structure. Does tanning mean sunlight or artificial devices? Does put limits mean banning devices or restricting time? Do skin diseases mean irritation or cancer? If the answers are unclear, the reader cannot know what conclusion she is accepting. The problem is not that every word needs a dictionary entry. It is that a central word cannot be allowed to change meaning while carrying the argument. Quote, "You cannot react to an argument unless you understand the meanings of crucial terms and phrases. Context, definitions, and communication." Context is the principal guide because writers rarely provide formal definitions. Context includes the communicator's background, the history of the term and the controversy, and the sentences surrounding its use. Human rights may mean employment, housing, and healthcare in one political setting and speech, religion, travel, and assembly in another. Neither meaning is self-evident merely because the phrase sounds familiar. The authors distinguish a synonym, an example, and a definition by specific criteria. Anxiety is feeling nervous supplies a synonym. Pointing to a candidate during an election supplies an example. Describing a subjective feeling of discomfort accompanied by autonomic sensitivity supplies criteria. Controversial arguments need the third kind. A dictionary may offer synonyms without telling us what counts as the thing in this argument. Quality of education, for instance, might mean grade point, critical thinking ability, doctoral faculty, or the amount of work required to pass. Each criterion would alter the judgment. The reader's responsibility has a limit. Ask for clarification and seek the context. If an ambiguity still makes a reason impossible to judge, set that reason aside rather than pretending to understand it. The writer's responsibility is to make the intended meaning available. The same rule governs our own speech and writing. Define central abstract terms, keep their meaning stable, ask how an opponent would understand them, and invite an outside reader to find meanings we have assumed are obvious. Clarity is not a tedious preface to real thinking. It is part of thinking. When a student and teacher use different definitions of rape, or when an argument about privacy never says whether it means physical privacy, information privacy, or Fourth Amendment protection, the disagreement may be verbal before it is substantive. To clarify the word is to discover what one actually believes. The practice passages make the procedure concrete. A dress code argument rests on the word inappropriate, which may mean insulting clothing, a prohibited political message, a skirt of a particular length, or something else entirely. A tablet advocate says devices cost less and use less paper, but the reader must ask whether this means initial price or lifetime cost, and whether less paper includes the printing and replacement created by the new system. In both cases, the ambiguity is significant because different meanings lead to different judgments. The writer can reduce such failures by defining terms in the issue and conclusion, clarifying the reasons, identifying abstract words, and asking how an opponent would define them. The argument itself can sometimes supply the definition, as when a claim about happiness specifies a measurable bodily response. An outside reader is especially useful because unfamiliarity with the writer's private assumptions makes hidden meanings visible. The reward is not merely a more defensible essay. It is a sharper mind on the other side of the definition. Chapter 5. What are the value and descriptive assumptions? The hidden structure of arguments. Most arguments appear to make sense because the visible reasons and conclusion have been arranged to fit one another. Yet the visible structure is held together by an invisible one. Unstated beliefs that make the movement from reason to conclusion seem natural. Assumptions are hidden, taken for granted, influential in determining the conclusion, and potentially deceptive. They are the unseen maneuvers of the magician. We see the handkerchief enter the hat and the rabbit emerge, but we do not yet know how the trick was performed. The argument that police must enforce laws against public intoxication illustrates the point. The reason may be true. People are not taking enough personal initiative to follow the law. But the reason supports stronger enforcement only if we assume that collective responsibility is more desirable than individual responsibility. A reader who ranks personal responsibility above government intervention will not experience the same logical movement. The disagreement is not necessarily about the fact. It is about the hidden bridge. The search should be restricted to assumptions that affect the reasoning. Look for beliefs needed to connect reasons to conclusions and for beliefs needed to make the reasons themselves true. The question is not, what has the writer ever assumed, but what must this writer believe for this reason to support this conclusion? That question reveals why assumptions are among the most powerful objects of critical evaluation. Value conflicts and priorities. Value assumptions are implicit preferences for one value over another in a particular context. People may agree that safety, freedom, fairness, efficiency, cooperation, and honesty are all good. Their disagreement appears when those values collide. Students object to faculty cuts in the name of fairness and reliability, while an administration defends them in the name of efficiency and frugality. The argument against legalizing recreational drugs depends on valuing public safety above individual responsibility. The conclusion is not carried by the factual reason alone. It is carried by the priority silently placed behind it. The authors provide recurring conflicts as search tools: loyalty versus honesty, competition versus cooperation, freedom of the press versus national security, order versus freedom of speech, and rationality versus spontaneity. Background can offer a clue, since a corporate executive, union leader, physician, or party official may have interests that shape what she protects. But background is only a clue, not a verdict. A group does not think with one mind, and a person's membership never proves the value assumptions of a particular argument. Consequences provide another route. If a writer rejects nuclear power because of dangerous waste, environmental protection, or public health is being weighted heavily. If another writer stresses the supply and cost of electricity, efficiency is carrying greater weight. Reverse role-playing asks what the opposing side cares about. This matters because recognizing another person's value priorities can make disagreement more intelligent. Haidt's contrast between liberal care and conservative authority is useful not because it settles politics, but because it makes the hidden moral vocabulary audible. Conflict rather than inventory. The important question is not whether people value safety and freedom, but which one they rank first when the two collide. Consequence as clue. The outcomes treated as desirable reveal which value is silently steering the argument. Background as clue, not verdict. A communicator's position may suggest protected interests, but group membership never proves an individual's priorities. Contextual priority. A value preference belongs to a particular controversy and may shift when the facts, risks, or affected people change. Reason value judgment. Values are not beyond argument. Their priority still requires reasons and evidence. Quote, value assumptions are directing the reasoning from behind screen. The chapter refuses relativism without pretending that values are simple facts. Value preferences are not like ice cream flavors, beyond all reasoning. They require support and evidence, and they may be challenged. At the same time, they are contextual. A person may prefer freedom in one controversy and community welfare in another. Critical thinking, therefore, asks not only which values exist, but which value is being given priority here, why, and with what consequences. This is where the chapter becomes more than a lesson in argument diagrams. A dispute that appears to be about whether a police force should enforce public intoxication laws may actually be a dispute about who bears responsibility for moral order. A debate about metal detectors may turn on whether privacy belongs above the safety of the student body. A debate about drug legalization may invoke public safety, paternalism, health, fiscal responsibility, and personal liberty at once. To name one value is not yet to explain the disagreement. The work lies in identifying the ranking that makes one consequence decisive and the rival consequence negligible. That ranking must also be tested for consistency without being treated as a rigid personality trait. The person who prizes individual freedom may accept a limit when the likely harm to a community becomes extreme. The person who prizes authority may resist it when authority becomes destructive. Context does not make values arbitrary. It shows that judgment is a practical act in which general ideals encounter particular people, risks, histories, and consequences. Reverse role-playing is therefore an exercise in moral imagination. If I defended the opposing conclusion, what would I be trying to protect, and what would I fear losing? Quote, because you know that thoughtful people have different value assumptions, you have the right to wonder why any single value assumption is being made. The critical reader should then ask the further question the chapter places behind every value preference. What reasons support the priority itself? If public safety is placed above individual responsibility, why is that priority appropriate in this case? If efficiency is placed above fairness, what harms are being accepted, and by whom? The authors do not promise that the answers will produce agreement. They promise something more honest. Disagreement can become visible as disagreement about what matters, rather than an endless quarrel in which each side repeats facts that the other side never used as its real bridge. Descriptive assumptions and their clues. Descriptive assumptions concern how the world was, is, or will become. In the car argument, repeated success with one model is offered as a reason to conclude that a particular car will reach its destination. The conclusion follows only if the model's quality remains consistent from year to year, and if the recommender's driving resembles the buyer's driving. The second assumption is also definitional. Driving may mean quiet suburban trips or hauling a trailer through Colorado. Change the meaning, and the relevance changes. The same method exposes common assumptions that quietly govern social judgment. That events are primarily the result of personal choices. That the speaker is a typical person. That the world is just. That the past will repeat itself. Or that one's own world is the center of the universe. None is automatically false, but each is debatable. The critical reader asks what would have to be true for the conclusion to follow, and whether the conclusion could still be false even if the stated reason were true. The search is a search for the gap. Imagine defending the conclusion and crawl into the communicator's background. Then identify with the opposition and ask what would make a reasonable person reject it. When a reason that Shakespeare is beneficial is used to require every student to see a performance, for example, we must ask whether the performance is well done and whether students can understand and relate to it. Those hidden conditions are not decorative additions. They are what make the reason relevant, writing with visible values and assumptions. The method turns inward when we write and speak. Our upbringing, education, religion, friends, and social position have shaped conclusions before we have examined the values beneath them. The authors recommend beginning with the possible conclusions to an issue, identifying the values that support each, choosing the conclusion most consistent with our priorities, and then selecting reasons whose value assumptions fit that conclusion and the context. If no good reasons can be found, return to the conclusion and reconsider it. The example of teaching reading makes the point. If fluency is the preferred outcome, convincing students that reading is enjoyable may be a necessary first step. If enriching the soul is the preferred outcome, one might instead emphasize difficulty and challenge. The factual reason has not changed. The desired end has. Making that end visible gives the audience an opportunity to understand the argument and gives the writer an opportunity to discover who she is. The chapter's deepest lesson is that arguments are never only what they say. They're also what they take for granted about what matters, what people are like, and what the world permits. Strong sense thinking brings the hidden bridge into the light, where it can be examined rather than crossed unconsciously. Chapter 6. Are there any fallacies in the reasoning? Fallacies as faulty assumptions. The first 4 questions have assembled the argument, issue, conclusion, reasons, and assumptions. Now the reader asks whether the reasoning deserves acceptance. Fallacies are the names given to common reasoning tricks, but the names are shorthand, not a substitute for thought. The practical method is to inspect the assumptions and ask whether they are false, doubtful, or irrelevant. The goal is to separate fool's gold from genuine gold without throwing away every reason merely because one part of an argument fails. An attack on Senator Spendall as a tax and spend liberal illustrates ad hominem. The senator's character does not by itself determine whether a tax increase would improve highways. The writer has shifted from a message to the messenger. The narrative fallacy is subtler. Seeing an officer shoot an African-American driver may activate a familiar story about racism, but the story is not yet an explanation. We do not know what the driver was doing, what the officer saw, or what the local department's history is. A story that makes facts intelligible is not necessarily the story that made them occur. Quote, "A fallacy is a reasoning trick that someone might use while trying to persuade you to accept a conclusion." Common reasoning tricks. The alcohol advertising example shows how the method works. The slippery slope reason assumes that permitting one restriction will make every later restriction uncontrollable, even though legal procedures may distinguish cases. The second reason rejects a restriction because it cannot eliminate drinking altogether, committing the search for a perfect solution fallacy. A partial reduction in harm may be better than no reduction. Waiting for perfection can become an excuse for paralysis. The chapter then names several recurring tricks. Appeal to popularity treats a majority belief as proof of goodness. Appeal to questionable authority cites a source without showing expertise in the issue. Appeal to emotion uses fear, pity, patriotism, or hope in place of relevant reasons. A straw person distorts the opposing position into an easier target. A false dilemma presents two choices where more exist. Explaining by naming give a label such as paranoid, jerk, or midlife crisis, and mistakes the label for a causal account. The planning fallacy is wishful underestimation of the time and difficulty a task will require despite repeated contrary experience. The value of the taxonomy lies in the question behind each name. Does the person attack the argument or the arguer? Does the story outrun the facts? Is the projected chain really uncontrollable? Does the solution need to be perfect? Is the authority qualified? Is the emotion doing work that evidence should do? Are there other options? Has a label merely replaced an explanation? These questions can find the error even when the Latin name is forgotten. Ad hominem and straw person. Test whether the argument has been replaced by an attack on the speaker or a distortion of the speaker's position. Slippery slope and false dilemma. Ask whether the chain is unavoidable and whether the supposed two choices exhaust the field. Appeal to emotion and popularity. Separate the feeling or majority sentiment being generated from the evidence that would establish the conclusion. Explaining by naming. Do not confuse a label for a behavior with an account of the causes that produced it. Planning fallacy. Compare the confident forecast with the person's or organization's repeated history of underestimating time and difficulty. Diversions and begging the question. Many fallacies succeed by diverting attention from the relevant issue. Political speech filled with democracy, the American dream, truth, and common sense may create approval without telling us what the candidate has done or proposes to do. These are glittering generalities. Virtue words so broad that the audience can supply its own meaning. A red herring changes the subject. When a question about a drug company's distortion of safety research becomes a discussion of whether people still use the drug, or when a daughter answers, "Why did you lie?" with "You're always picking on me," topic B has displaced topic A. Begging the question is the most circular trick. Traditional textbooks are said to be better because it is advantageous to use materials in textbook format. The reason merely repeats the conclusion in different words. The cure is to ask whether the reason gives an independent advantage, such as greater retention, rather than assuming the thing being proved. The authors end with a constructive caution. Finding a fallacy licenses rejection of that part of the reasoning, not necessarily of every reason the communicator offered. In conversation, Ask whether better reasons are available and return to the original issue. Critical thinking is not a contest to announce, "Aha, I caught you." It is the art of finding where the argument fails while leaving room for the person to repair it. The practice passages show how several tricks can work together. A claim that legalizing same-sex marriage will inevitably produce polygamy and incest combines emotional language, appeals to politicians, slippery slope reasoning, and a false dilemma about national morality. A defense of fraternity parties attacks critics as antisocial loners, treats one person's clean parties as representative, rejects regulation because it will not eliminate every assault, and predicts that one ban will become a ban on all social events. The point is not to memorize a label for each sentence. It is to ask what assumption would have to be true for the purported reason to be relevant. This insistence on diagnosis protects against two opposite mistakes. We should not accept a bad reason because its fallacy has no famous name, and we should not reject a whole argument because one reason is defective when other reasons remain open to assessment. The critical reader keeps the original issue in view, tests each supporting move, and invites the speaker back to the question she tried to escape. Chapter 7. The Worth of Personal Experience, Case Examples, Testimonials, and Authority. Fact, opinion, and dependable evidence. Evidence moves a claim away from mere opinion and toward fact, but the authors refuse the childish picture in which facts are simply true and opinions simply false. Even a baseball pitch is filtered through the umpire's position, expectations, the shadows, the history of earlier calls, and the definition of the strike zone. Factual claims have different degrees of dependability. The useful question is not whether a claim has achieved absolute certainty, but whether we can count on it more than its alternatives. This is why the critical thinker repeatedly asks, "What is your proof? How do you know? Where is the evidence? And why do you believe that?" Evidence is explicit information used to support the dependability of a factual claim. No evidence is a guaranteed slam dunk. The task is to find better evidence and judge how much weight it deserves. Personal experience, case examples, testimonials, authority, observation, studies, and analogies can all help, but each carries characteristic weaknesses. Experience, cases, and testimonials. Personal experience is vivid and therefore dangerous. A friend who studies successfully after staying up all night may show that this outcome is possible, but not that sleep is unnecessary. A painful encounter with one mechanic may make every mechanic look dishonest. The mind mistakes what is memorable for what is representative. That is the hasty generalization fallacy. A few cases cannot establish what is typical of a large group. Case examples work similarly. A university president can point to one graduate who succeeded at Harvard, or a politician can tell a heartbreaking story about a child killed by a distracted driver. Such cases give an abstract issue a human face and may show that a possibility is real. They do not by themselves tell us how common the possibility is. Their narrative vividness is a reason to pay attention, not a reason to accept the general conclusion. Testimonials add selection, interest, omitted standards, and a human factor. The celebrity whose acne cleared, the friend who calls a film the best ever, or the reader who could not put down a book may be sincere. Sincerity does not answer whether the experience is typical, whether the witness had something to gain, what criteria produced the judgment, or what happened to the people whose testimony was not selected. Expectations shape perception. Believing can become seeing. Quote, "Be wary of striking case examples as proof." Appeals to authority. We cannot become experts in every dimension of life, so appeals to authority are unavoidable. The question is not whether to trust authorities, but how much. Expertise must fit the subject. The authority should have access to the relevant facts, preferably first-hand access, and a record of dependable claims. We must also ask about distorting interests, expectations, ideology, and financial gain. A doctor recommending a product made by a company paying for her research is not automatically wrong, but the relationship changes how carefully we should inspect the claim. The history of expert error supplies humility. Thomas Watson once predicted a market for perhaps 5 computers. Daryl Zanuck thought video would quickly lose its audience. Expertise is useful precisely when it is tested, qualified, and open to correction. Agreement among authorities with different interests is more reassuring than the confidence of one famous person. On the internet, where anyone can announce credentials and reviews can be bought, the reader must trace claims to primary sources, inspect dates and methods, look for qualifications, and compare independent sites. The chapter's conclusion is measured rather than cynical. Weak personal evidence gives us grounds to hesitate, not permission to mock. Ask for better evidence. A testimonial may begin inquiry. A case may awaken concern. An authority may orient the search. But the critical reader must not let vividness, enthusiasm, or status do the work of representation, method, and corroboration. Chapter 8. How good is the evidence? Personal observation and research studies. Observation, surveys, and the scientific method. Personal observation feels immediate, but observers are not mirrors. What we see is filtered through values, expectations, training, previous experience, attention, and stress. An eyewitness near a gun may remember the event selectively. Several people can stand in the same scene and report different realities. The most dependable observations are recent, made by several observers under good conditions, and gathered without a strong interest in a particular result. Surveys introduce another layer between the world and the claim. Respondents may shade the truth, give the answer they think they ought to give, misunderstand the question, resent the questionnaire, or answer without reflection. A question about quality programming can mean several things to several people. Leading words can manufacture an attitude before the respondent answers, and context can change the response to an identical question. A question about lowering the drinking age may receive a different answer after a question about voting rights than when it appears alone. Even fatigue can alter responses later in a long survey. Survey evidence is not rejected, it is qualified. Ask how the questions were worded, who was sampled, how the survey was placed in context, and what biases the procedures introduce. A bias survey can still inform us if we know its bias and do not generalize beyond what it warrants. Research quality and replication. Research studies are a form of authority because trained investigators systematically collect observations. The scientific method improves upon ordinary intuition by seeking publicly verifiable data, control over extraneous factors, and precision in language. Replication matters because a finding that only one researcher can produce may be an artifact. Control helps reduce error, although control is harder to achieve in complex human behavior, where laboratory conditions may become too artificial to represent life. Research is therefore strong in possibility, not infallible in fact. Studies vary in quality. Findings contradict one another. Researchers interpret rather than simply report results. Funding and professional reward can distort questions, methods, interpretation, and publication. Popular communicators often remove the qualifications from an original report, and claims about human behavior can change over time. A peer-reviewed article deserves attention, not surrender. The authors reject the impossible certainty fallacy. Because no research conclusion is absolutely certain does not mean all conclusions are equally weak. The proper response to uncertainty is proportion, not paralysis. Look for replication, peer review, a transparent method, qualification, a broad research context, independent scrutiny, and evidence that contradictory findings have not been quietly omitted. Samples, measures, and expert opinion. Generalization is where many apparently scientific claims overreach. A study of 229 volunteers from one dating site cannot establish what is true of most people who use online dating. A sample must be large enough, broad enough to resemble the population, and as random as possible. We can generalize only to people and events like those studied. The same caution applies to measurement. Research findings generalize only to the measures used. A one-time self-report of happiness is not happiness in every sense. A marshmallow choice is not the whole of delayed gratification. A multiple-choice test may not measure critical thinking as well as a critical essay. Before accepting a conclusion, ask what was measured, whether the measure captures the concept, and whether another measure might produce a different result. Expert opinion deserves the most trust when it has survived the protocol, includes qualifications, avoids universal claims, appears within a broad body of research, and has been challenged by informed opponents. The reader should let thinking lead and emotion follow. An opinion that feels urgent, novel, or perfectly suited to one side is a signal to slow down, not a certificate of truth. The governing standard is proportionality. We should not demand impossible certainty from a careful study, but neither should we let a single impressive finding carry a universal claim. A conclusion about one group, one instrument, one time, or one laboratory condition must remain attached to those limits. The more a communicator removes the qualifications, the more the reader must put them back. Sample. Is it large, diverse, and random enough for the population named in the conclusion? Measure. Does the instrument capture the concept, or only one narrow operational definition of it? Replication. Has the results survived other investigators, methods, and the wider research record? Conflict and context. Who funded the work? What interests are present? And how artificial were the conditions? Quote, the most reliable conclusions do not emerge from single, attention-grabbing studies, but from the studies of many experts over a period of time. Conclusions based only on single studies are highly suspect and often wrong. Research and writing on the internet. The internet makes evidence abundant and credibility difficult. Anyone can create a page, imitate the appearance of authority, purchase a review, or repeat a snippet stripped from its original context. The practical response is to investigate the author's credentials and interests, locate the original source, check dates and methods, compare independent accounts, and prefer library and peer-reviewed portals to an unfiltered search result. The writer faces the same discipline. Emotional stories, metaphors, testimonials, and quotations may engage readers, but they should be joined to relevant, sufficient, representative evidence. We must apply to our own experience the same skepticism we apply to someone else's. If a conclusion cannot survive the search for good support, we should discard or revise it rather than defend it with a pile of anecdotes. The failure is not a humiliation. It is the point at which inquiry has done its work. The book's sample studies show how the questions operate together. A survey of people in Alcoholics Anonymous may find that many report alcoholic parents, but the participants are volunteers from a few states. The comparison group is self-described, and neither alcoholic nor the parent's condition has been defined with dependable criteria. A survey of Detroit residents about medical marijuana cannot establish a national policy merely because 93% of 75 respondents expressed an opinion. The issue is not whether the numbers exist. It is whether the sample, measure, question, and conclusion belong to the same argument. The same care applies to comparisons. The claim that 18-year-olds should drink because 21-year-olds may drink overlooks differences in psychological development and social responsibility. Similarity in voting, driving, or living independently does not establish identity in every relevant respect. An analogy is evidence only when the shared features matter to the conclusion and the differences do not defeat the comparison. When the evidence fails, the writer has several honest choices: narrow the conclusion, seek stronger sources, qualify the claim, or begin again. Continuing to argue with poor evidence merely because one has already invested time in the thesis is belief perseverance in scholarly clothing. The critical writer's pride lies not in never abandoning a claim, but in abandoning it before it makes a fool of the evidence. Quote, research findings do not prove conclusions. At best, they support conclusions. Chapter 9. Are there rival causes? The pervasiveness of rival causes. The chapter opens with a child who sees the sun disappear when his babysitter goes home and concludes that the babysitter causes night. The explanation makes sense from the child's limited position. That is precisely the danger. A plausible story is not yet a demonstrated cause. Whenever a communicator uses words such as leads to, influences, determines, increases the likelihood, or is associated with, the reader should begin looking for rival causes, plausible alternative explanations for the same outcome. Rival causes appear in private life, public tragedy, and research. A boyfriend who has not returned a text may be angry, busy, or without his phone. A mass killing may be attributed to family conflict, violent games, medication, mental illness, or a combination not visible in the first news cycle. A study may find that women who breastfed have fewer later health problems, but the difference might reflect exercise, diet, work stress, medication, smoking, or the reason some women did not breastfeed. The expert usually offers a favored cause. The critical thinker must generate the rivals. Correlation, causation, and time. Human events more often have multiple contributory causes than one sovereign cause. Different cases of depression can have different causal patterns, and a factor may be a cause without being the cause. To reduce a complex event to one factor is causal oversimplification. Multiple perspectives help because sociologists, psychologists, biologists, police officers, environmentalists, and political groups notice different parts of the causal field. The perspective that determines what we look for also determines what we can see. Correlation is especially treacherous. If X and Y occur together, at least 4 explanations remain possible. X causes Y. Y causes X. A third factor Z causes both, or X and Y influence each other. The alleged finding that smoking combats flu or that ice cream causes crime collapses when these alternatives are considered. Summer heat may increase both ice cream sales and crime. Association is a clue, not a causal verdict. Temporal sequence is no safer. The quarter found before a good test, a canceled class, and a favorite movie may feel lucky, but after this is not because of this. The post hoc fallacy turns sequence into causation. Political leaders use the same shortcut when they take credit for every good event after entering office. X causes Y. The proposed direction may be right, but it must be established rather than assumed. Y causes X. The outcome may influence the behavior or condition used to explain it. Common cause Z. A third factor may produce both events and create a misleading association. Mutual influence. The two events may shape each other over time rather than stand in a one-way chain. Quote, association or correlation does not prove causation. Individual events and evaluating causes. When explaining one historical event or one person's act, the evidence is especially fragile. We reconstruct stories from incomplete reports and distorted memories, while social and political commitments guide which causes appear plausible. The fundamental attribution error makes us overestimate personal tendencies and underestimate circumstances. We see theft as a thief's character before considering poverty, peer pressure, drugs, or an immediate crisis. The cure is not to refuse explanation, but to compare explanations. Ask whether each rival is logically sound, consistent with other knowledge, successful in explaining similar events, disconfirmed by accepted beliefs, and able to explain a wider variety of facts. The more plausible rivals we can generate, the less confidence we should place in the first account until further evidence arrives. Causal humility is not indecision. It is a refusal to let a neat story outrun the world. Logical soundness. Does the proposed cause fit the argument without requiring a hidden contradiction? Consistency. Does it fit what we already know about similar events and circumstances? Explanatory reach. Does it account for more of the available facts than its competitors? Disconfirmation. Which accepted facts count against it, and how many of those facts can it survive? Exploring causes in our own communication. Causal writing begins with a question, then an intentionally creative search for possible answers. The authors recommend adopting the attitude of an annoying 5-year-old and continuing to ask, why else? Why did a television show break records? Perhaps its audience likes zombies. Perhaps it filled a neglected niche. Perhaps its writing, acting, and direction were unusually good. Friends and classmates can supply rivals we would not have generated alone. Before claiming that one cause explains an outcome, establish that a relationship exists, establish its direction, and show that it explains the evidence better than competing accounts. Ernie's banana keeps alligators away only because there are no alligators on Sesame Street. The apparent success of the banana proves nothing. The responsible writer names a contributory cause as a contributory cause, qualifies the claim, and leaves room for the facts to demand a different story. Chapter 10. Are any statistics deceptive? Unknowable numbers and averages. Numbers look like facts wearing laboratory coats. A graph can make a tiny difference look dramatic by narrowing its scale, and a headline can make an estimate seem exact because it prints a large percentage in capital letters. Statistics are evidence expressed as numbers, but numbers do not necessarily prove what they appear to prove. The first question is how the number was obtained. Some statistics concern events that are difficult or impossible to define and count accurately. Tax cheating, drug use, sacred reading, distracted driving, or the true prevalence of a disorder. Ambiguous terms, hidden events, unwilling respondents, failures to report, and physical limits on observation turn many numbers into educated guesses. Estimates can be useful, but their precision should not outrun their method. The word average is another warning light. The mean adds all values and divides. The median is the middle value. The mode is the most frequent value. A few enormous professional salaries can lift the mean far above what most players earn. The range and distribution matter as well, especially when a median survival time might conceal a long tail of people who live for years. Most people do not equal the average, and the average does not tell the whole story. Mean, the total divided by the number of values, vulnerable to unusually high or low cases. Median, the middle value, often more informative when extremes distort the mean. Mode, the most frequent value or range, useful for seeing what occurs most often. Range and distribution, the spread and frequency of outcomes that an average conceals. Measurement and statistical conclusions. Every statistic rests on a measurement, and every measurement can be wrong. The dispute over football pressure illustrates how timing and temperature can create a difference that looks like misconduct. Blood alcohol evidence depends on calibrated instruments and reliable calibration procedures. If the device is inaccurate or inconsistent, the number cannot carry the legal conclusion placed upon it. The next deception occurs when the statistic proves one thing and the communicator concludes another. If electronic gadgets make up 70% of subway thefts, that does not show that a rider is highly likely to be robbed. The total number of thefts may be very small. If 36 of 75 mall respondents say they have friends who cheated, the result concerns those respondents in that place and their reports about friends, not almost half of all Americans. Blind yourself to the conclusion and ask what conclusion the numbers actually warrant. Quote, statistics can and often do lie. They do not necessarily prove what they appear to prove. Missing information and responsible use. Numbers also deceive through omission. A 75% increase might mean 4 businesses became 7 or 12 became 21. A national count of 54,000 cases means little without the population denominator and the relevant comparison. Percentages need absolute numbers. Absolute numbers need percentages. Both need a base rate and a time frame. The reader should ask how the statistic was obtained, which average is being used, whether range and distribution matter, whether the number proves the stated conclusion, what conclusion follows when the claim is hidden, and what relevant information is missing. The writer faces the reciprocal duty. Statistics can describe trends, patterns, and probabilities, but responsible writing explains how they were produced and what their limits are. Such candor does not weaken persuasion. It tells the audience that the writer is not trying to sneak something past them. The chapter therefore treats statistical literacy as a moral form of restraint. A number can alarm, flatter, or authorize before anyone is asked what measures. Slow thinking restores the missing questions and returns the statistic to its proper size. Chapter 11. What significant information is omitted? The necessity of incomplete reasoning. The advertisement for Happy Time says it is the #1 doctor-prescribed treatment for backache. It does not say whether doctors receive larger discounts, free samples, or cruises for prescribing it. That silence may matter more than the praise. Critical thinkers seek autonomy, but autonomy is impossible when a decision rests on the portion of reality someone else has selected for us. Significant omitted information is not every fact left unsaid. It is information that would affect whether the argument should influence us, information that shapes the reasoning. Every message is organized for a purpose, and advertisers, politicians, teachers, researchers, bloggers, and parents present some features because they want those features to guide our judgment. When the gold nugget appears, pause and ask what gravel has been left in the pan. Questions for what is missing. Incomplete reasoning is inevitable. Time, space, attention, limited knowledge, perspective, and deliberate deception all produce omissions. The omission is not automatically dishonest. The question is whether the missing piece is load-bearing. A television commentator may simplify because the segment is short, while an advertiser may conceal a defect because disclosure would reduce sales. The same omission can be accidental in one setting and manipulative in another. The authors offer a searching practice. Ask for common counterarguments and contradictory studies, alternative definitions, missing value perspectives, the origin of factual claims, the procedures used to gather them, alternative methods, incomplete graphs and data, omitted positive and negative effects, and the prediction failures of people who advertise special foresight. When a claim uses measurable words such as more, faster, greater, or after, ask for the specific numbers. A statement that the United States scores higher on a happiness scale than Denmark is nearly empty until we know the scale, the difference, the sample, and the distribution. Counter-evidence. What would an informed opponent say, and which studies or authorities support that side? Definitions and origins. What do the key terms mean, and where did the factual claims come from? Procedures and alternatives. How was the evidence gathered, and would another method produce a different result? Figures and numbers. What comparisons, denominators, time frames, and ranges have been left out? Effects and failures. Who loses, what long-term harms follow, and how often has the predictor been wrong? The question, what relevant information is missing, joins the previous questions into a wider field of vision. Definitions, numbers, procedures, and counterarguments may all be absent while the visible claim remains technically true. Negative effects and unanswered gaps. The most important omission is often the negative view. Proposals arrive surrounded by promised benefits, a new medication, a large school, a tax cut, more leisure, better health. Ask which groups do not benefit and who loses, how power shifts, what happens to health and relationships, what happens to the environment, and what the long-term cost will be. A new school may destroy habitat, draw teachers and funding away from other schools, alter property values, and raise taxes. None of those consequences is refuted by the claim that the school will educate children. Sometimes the missing information remains unavailable. The critical thinker has done her part by asking. She can voice the limitation, continue searching, or cautiously accept the argument only because it is better supported than its competitors. Missing information does not justify refusing to form any opinion. Otherwise, no decision would ever be possible. It does require a conclusion proportioned to what is known. Writing with selective completeness. Writers face the same problem from the other side. A thesis should be precise enough that omitted definitions do not change its meaning. College should be free for everyone. Leaves open what counts as college, what free covers, who pays, and whether tuition alone is met. Narrowing the claim to free tuition at public universities for in-state students makes the argument more intelligible and more vulnerable to honest evaluation. The writer should list support and counterarguments, ask which questions the evidence can answer, and selectively filter without hiding what is essential. If a significant omission remains, address it in the counterargument rather than hoping the audience will not notice. A strong argument is not one that contains every fact. It is one that does not conceal the facts on which its conclusion depends. Quote, "It is not enough to ask what the argument says. Ask what the argument leaves you unable to see." Chapter 12. What reasonable conclusions are possible? Beyond dichotomous thinking. Even after reasons have survived the earlier questions, they rarely force one conclusion. The reasons about advertising to children may support prohibition, but they may also support content regulation, parental education, or a qualified restriction under specific conditions. The critical thinker must therefore ask not only whether the author's conclusion is possible, but what other conclusions are equally consistent with the evidence and the values in play. Dichotomous thinking narrows the field before inquiry has finished. Yes or no, right or wrong, for or against. These pairs are sometimes useful, but important questions seldom end there. A student asked whether scientists should pursue stem cell research may need to ask when, where, why, for what purpose, and under what safeguards. It depends is not always evasion. It may be the honest shape of a conclusion whose conditions have not yet been specified. Gray thinking and if clauses. Gray thinking is reflective attention to the space between black and white. Whether to major in chemistry depends on aptitude, interest, alternatives, employment, artificial intelligence, training, and professional networks. Whether the United States should engage in peacekeeping depends on national interests, the mission, the likelihood of war, and the values one is trying to protect. A qualified answer can be more decisive than an absolute one because it tells us what would make the answer true. The practical instrument is the if clause. If a tax cut is targeted toward those at the lower end of the economic spectrum, then one conclusion may follow. If the purpose is a different distribution of benefits, another may follow. If a novel has a clear protagonist, antagonist, and climax, then a certain evaluation may be justified. If automakers can produce more efficient cars, then a different policy becomes reasonable. The conditional form makes assumptions visible and expresses humility without surrendering action. Quote, "Very rarely do reasons fit just one conclusion." Quote, "The advantage of maybe or it depends on as an answer is that it forces you to admit that you do not yet know enough to make a definite answer. But at the same time you avoid a definite answer, you form a tentative decision or opinion that calls for commitment and eventual action. The freedom of alternative conclusions. Facts and logic take us only part of the way toward belief. If they dictated one conclusion mechanically, learning would mean receiving the correct beliefs from a teacher. Instead, the search for alternative conclusions enlarges personal responsibility. We must choose among conclusions that the reasons permit, guided by evidence, context, and value preferences. The author's examples show how a single set of reasons can alter the portrait of the situation. Dining halls may be failing students, or they may be protecting low prices and reducing waste. Churches may need to lose tax exemptions, where the conflict may call for constitutional interpretation or better civic education. The alternative is not a cheap both sides gesture. It is a deliberate attempt to expose conditions that the first conclusion treated as settled. The result is a form of intellectual freedom. We are not free because no conclusion is better than another. We are free because we can see more than one reasonable route and select the route that survives our questions. A strong conclusion is therefore often a qualified one, a claim with its conditions attached, a decision that knows what it does not know. Chapter 13. Speed bumps interfering with your critical thinking. Social discomfort and slow thinking. Learning the questions does not remove the obstacles to using them. The authors call these obstacles speed bumps because they can be overcome when we slow down, because they exist whether or not we notice them, and because awareness does not make them disappear. The first is social discomfort. A person receiving question after question may feel as if she is on the witness stand, even when the questioner intends partnership. Critical thinking can damage a relationship when it is performed as prosecution. The remedy is diplomatic curiosity. Know the audience, make the desire to learn visible, and remember that the person may not experience questioning as a gift. The second speed bump is thinking too quickly. System 1 offers immediate judgments from limited information. System 2 can absorb and evaluate, but only when trained to interrupt the first answer. The book's two-word command is simple: slow down. Quote, "If you had to summarize the message of our text in 2 words, it would be slow down." Stereotypes and mental habits. Stereotypes are shortcuts that load an issue before the reasoning begins. They turn membership in a group into a supposed set of personal traits. The young are frivolous, welfare recipients are lazy, or one nationality is industrious. Each person deserves attention as an individual, and each argument deserves evaluation rather than a verdict issued by the label attached to its speaker. The halo effect works in both directions. One admirable quality makes us assume that a celebrity is wise in every matter. One shameful act makes us reject everything a person says. Belief perseverance makes our current opinion sticky, because we have invested ourselves in our beliefs. Contrary evidence feels like an insult to the self. Confirmation bias then helps us see supportive evidence as good and opposing evidence as defective. The strong sense response is to treat judgments as tentative and to regard changing one's mind in light of a superior argument as strength rather than hypocrisy. Belief, availability, and the wrong question. The availability heuristic lets whatever information is easiest to recall dominate judgment. Terrorism is vivid, organized, and repeatedly reported, while starvation and unsafe water are distant and chronic. The vivid danger, therefore, seems larger than the statistical one. The recent airplane crash can make flying feel unsafe even while systematic safety data show how unusual the event is. Recency is not relevance. Another speed bump answers a question that was never asked. The question whether Steph Curry is the best player ever is not answered by the number of games he has lost. Keith Richards' response that he and Mick Jagger are professionals and do what is necessary for music evades the question of whether their feud is over. A substituted question distracts the listener and prevents the protocol from staying focused on one issue. Egocentrism and wishful thinking. Egocentrism makes our pantry more compelling than the hunger of thousands, our opinions more trustworthy than the experiences of people unlike us, and our knowledge more easily communicated than it really is. The cure is deliberate perspective-taking. Listen to people outside the immediate tribe. Ask whether you have heard what they mean and why they mean it, and remember the curse of knowledge. Sheldon explains semiotics to Penny without noticing that he has not explained himself to her at all. Wishful thinking is the most dangerous speed bump because it bends the whole protocol toward comfort. Colbert's truthiness names the preference for what we wish were true over what evidence supports. Magical thinking promises control when reality feels unbearable. Political promises, rosy forecasts, and Harry Potter's "I just know" all replace evidence with desire. The critical thinker must ask whether a claim is true because the facts support it or because the mind needs it to be true. Truthiness. A claim feels true because it fits a desired picture of the world, not because the evidence has earned that confidence. Denial. The mind erases facts that would make the future frightening, humiliating, or politically inconvenient. Magical causation. Powerlessness invites a promise that a person, product, leader, or idea will make everything wonderful without showing how. The critical antidote. Ask whether the belief is true because we want it to be true, and then demand the evidence that would remain if the wish were removed. Wishful thinking is more than one bias among others because it can recruit the entire method in its service. A person who wants a comforting conclusion may choose congenial authorities, resolve ambiguous terms in the desired direction, overlook rival causes, call a vivid case representative, and treat a partial statistic as decisive. The questions are still being asked, but the answers have been arranged in advance. That is why truthiness is the most dangerous speed bump. It can make a carefully performed evaluation arrive at the conclusion the heart selected before the inquiry began. The authors connect this distortion to denial. Leaders promise that wars will soon be over because the alternative, a long conflict without a clean victory, is too painful for a population to face. Individuals accept a product label because they want the product to be honest, and they prefer a magical cause when randomness or helplessness is intolerable. The cure is not emotional self-contempt. It is the small, repeated act of separating the wished-for world from the evidenced world, then asking what action remains possible in the latter. Quote, "A person is loyal to truthiness when he prefers concepts or facts he wishes to be true, rather than concepts or facts known to be true." Quote, Professor Severus Snape, indeed. Your evidence? Harry, I just know. Severus Snape, you just know? Sarcastically, once again, you astound me with your gifts, Potter. Final words, a critical thinker's habits. The final chapter returns critical thinking to identity and action. A critical thinker reads broadly enough to understand assumptions from multiple perspectives, depends on reasons and evidence, approaches beliefs with willingness to agree but a questioning attitude, and seeks and respects multiple perspectives. These habits are neither natural nor easy. They require frequent self-assessment. The question should be voiced as curiosity, not as the triumphant cry, "Ah, I caught you making an error." Critical thinking is not a sterile classroom hobby or a performance of cleverness. It is a partnership for action among reasonable people. Once the best answer available has been found, it must become a basis for behavior, a way of living with an identity one can respect and a community one is willing to serve. Conclusion. The book's governing promise is modest enough to be practiced and ambitious enough to change a life. Before accepting a belief, ask the questions that reveal what the belief is made of. Begin by finding the issue and conclusion. Then find the reasons, clarify the words, expose the value and descriptive assumptions, test for fallacies, weigh the evidence, generate rival causes, inspect the statistics, search for omissions, and ask what other conclusions the reasons permit. The sequence is not a ritual of suspicion. It is a way of giving judgment a structure sturdy enough to resist the last confident voice we encountered. The method's deepest achievement is to join independence with dependence. We cannot know the world alone. Experts, witnesses, studies, histories, and other minds provide the materials from which our conclusions are built. But receiving those materials is not the same as surrendering to them. The reader remains responsible for measuring the evidence, noticing the hidden value priorities, and deciding how firmly to hold the result. The result may be agreement, revision, or refusal. What matters is that the conclusion has passed through questions rather than merely through the mind's appetite for certainty. That discipline also changes the moral temperature of disagreement. Strong sense thinking asks us to examine our own beliefs as rigorously as another person's, to distinguish an attack on an argument from an attack on its speaker, and to make curiosity visible when questions might feel threatening. The protocol can expose manipulation, but its proper end is not humiliation. The reader is taught to remain a partner in inquiry, to reject a fallacious reason without rejecting every possible reason, and to invite a conversation back toward the issue. The book does not promise perfect evidence or a world without ambiguity. Most conclusions remain qualified. Research can be revised. Memories can mislead. Statistics can omit their denominators. And causes can multiply beyond a neat story. Its final pressure is therefore a summons to intellectual humility joined to action. Slow down. Ask what the evidence actually supports. Choose the best conclusion available, and then let that conclusion govern conduct until a better one arrives. Key persons discussed: M. Neil Browne and Stuart M. Keeley, the principal authors of the manual, writing as practical instructors who turn critical thinking into a sequence of questions, exercises, and habits rather than an abstract theory of logic. Mary Vasudeva, the writing and speaking contributor whose attention to thesis, tone, audience, counterargument, and the responsible use of evidence extends the method from reading arguments to making them. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist whose distinction between fast system 1 thinking and slower system 2 evaluation supplies the book's account of why judgment must be deliberately delayed. Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist whose elephant and rider image dramatizes the struggle between emotional impulse and rational control, and whose account of liberal care and conservative authority illustrates the importance of recognizing other people's value priorities. Richard Paul, the source of the distinction between weak-sense critical thinking, which defends present beliefs, and strong-sense critical thinking, which evaluates all beliefs, especially one's own. David H. Friedman, the author used to show that experts can sound more certain than their evidence warrants, and that expert judgment must be compared, qualified, and tested. Stephen Colbert, the satirist whose truthiness names the temptation to prefer what feels or wishes itself true over what evidence supports. Roger Ebert, the film critic whose vivid insult about Transformers, Revenge of the Fallen becomes an example of how tone can attract attention while closing the door to dialogue. Richard Feynman, the physicist invoked for the strong sense habit of searching first for every way an idea might be wrong rather than merely collecting proof for it. Francis Bacon, the early modern thinker used to frame changing one's mind in response to superior argument as a strength rather than a betrayal of identity. Key works discussed. Wrong. Why experts keep failing us. David H. Friedman, 2010. The source for the book's examples of contradictory expert advice and its warning that expertise supplies material for judgment rather than an automatic command. Thinking, Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman, the conceptual source for System 1 and System 2, the cognitive contrast that becomes the manual's practical command to slow down. A History of the Modern Fact. Mary Poovey, the work behind the reminder that facts have histories and contexts, even when numerical or factual claims appear self-evident. The Righteous Mind. Jonathan Haidt, the work used to show how different political communities can rank different moral values and why recognizing those priorities may improve disagreement. Attacking Faulty Reasoning. T. Edward Dahmer, the recommended companion for expanding one's knowledge of fallacies beyond the introductory taxonomy supplied here. The Experts Speak. Christopher Cerf and Victor Navasky, the source of memorable expert predictions that failed, including the mistaken belief that the world market might hold only 5 computers. The Bourne Ultimatum, The Big Bang Theory, and Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Popular cultural examples used to make perspective, the curse of knowledge, and evidence-free certainty visible in ordinary conversation. Index of key concepts. Argument. A conclusion joined to the reasons offered to support it. The argument is not a quarrel, but the visible structure through which people invite one another to improve beliefs and decisions. Issue. The question or controversy that stimulates a discussion. Descriptive issues ask how the world is. Prescriptive issues ask what should be done or what is good, right, or desirable. Conclusion. The message the communicator wants the reader or listener to accept. It must be distinguished from background, examples, statistics, definitions, and evidence, which may support it without being it. Reason. An explanation or rationale for why a conclusion should be believed. A reason becomes part of the argument because the communicator uses it as support, not merely because it is an assertion nearby. Evidence. Explicit information used to establish the dependability of a factual claim or the truth of a reason. Evidence is graded by quality and quantity. It rarely supplies absolute certainty. Ambiguity. The existence of multiple plausible meanings for a key word or phrase. Ambiguity matters when substituting one meaning for another changes how well the reason supports the conclusion. Value assumption. An unstated preference that gives one value priority over another in a particular context, such as public safety over individual responsibility or efficiency over fairness. Is the moral bridge that often makes a prescriptive reason seem decisive. Descriptive assumption. An unstated belief about how the world was, is, or will be. It connects a factual reason to a factual conclusion and may concern human nature, continuity across time, typicality, or the meaning of a key term. Strong sense critical thinking. The use of critical questions to evaluate every claim, including one's own. It may preserve an initial belief, but only after the belief has survived alternatives, evidence, and the possibility of correction. Managed reasoning. Reasoning that begins with a fixed conclusion and then shops for reasons and evidence that will move an audience toward it. It is the argumentative form of defending identity rather than allowing reasons to shape belief. Fallacy. A recurring reasoning trick or defective assumption that makes a conclusion appear better supported than it is. Naming a fallacy is useful shorthand, but the real work is showing which assumption fails. Rival cause. A plausible alternative explanation for an outcome. The number and quality of rival causes should reduce confidence in an initial causal story until further evidence distinguishes them. Correlation and causation. Events that occur together may stand in several relations. X may cause Y, Y may cause X, a third factor may cause both, or the events may influence each other. Association is evidence for inquiry, not proof of direction. Statistical deception. The use of numbers whose method, average, measurement, comparison, or conclusion misleads. Mean, median, and mode can tell different stories, and an impressive percentage may conceal a tiny base. Significant omitted information. Missing information that would change how much an argument should influence us. The critical reader searches for absent definitions, procedures, counterarguments, negative effects, alternative data, and prediction failures. Gray thinking. The effort to find qualified conclusions between a false pair of absolutes. It asks when, where, and why a claim is accurate and uses conditions to express uncertainty without abandoning judgment. System 1 and System 2. Fast, automatic thinking and slow, deliberate evaluation. The book's practical command is to train System 2 to interrupt the first answer when the belief or decision matters. Truthiness. Colbert's name for preferring a claim because it feels true or fits what one wishes were true. It is the emotional form of wishful thinking and can corrupt every stage of the critical protocol. Reading comprehension questions. What 3 conditions must be present for critical thinking to become a practiced disposition rather than a collection of definitions? How does the panning for gold style preserve the value of acquiring information while resisting the passivity of the sponge style? What is the difference between weak sense and strong sense critical thinking? And why can strong sense examination sometimes strengthen an initial belief? How do issue, conclusion, and reason differ? And what clues help a reader locate each when a communicator does not state them explicitly? Why can a true reason fail to support a conclusion when a value assumption or descriptive assumption is missing from the visible argument? Choose one of the book's fallacies and explain the hidden assumption that makes the reasoning appear persuasive. Why are personal experiences and case examples useful for showing possibilities, but weak as proof of what is typical? What questions should be asked about an authority's expertise, access to facts, bias, financial interest, and record of dependable claims? How can survey wording, survey context, sample selection, and measurement choices change what a research result appears to establish? What 4 causal explanations must be considered whenever X and Y are associated? And how does the ice cream and crime example illustrate the need for a common cause? Why can a statistic be technically accurate yet misleading? And what additional information is needed when a percentage, average, or absolute number is presented? What makes omitted information significant rather than merely absent? And why does the book especially emphasize negative and long-term effects? How do if clauses help a critical thinker form a conclusion without pretending to know more than the evidence permits? Which speed bump most threatens your own use of the protocol? Social discomfort, fast thinking, stereotype, halo effect, belief perseverance, availability, answering the wrong question, egocentrism, or wishful thinking? What evidence would show that it is operating?